We're here, people. What's up? It's another day for another podcast. This is usually the part where I have a colorful non sequitur / joke that I can get into, but my brain's kind of fried from the sun right now. It's summertime, people. I feel like there's usually like kind of a joke that goes along with that, right? Or am I just missing that? Like there's usually like that like super clickbaity like kind of phrase that people go with that I'm just like currently, it's not coming to me right now.
Dude, like you said, man, the sun was
It's the
strong
sun.
today, and we were chilling.
Yeah, right.
It
was
social distance hanging, and the sun
do you-
got me, you know?
Do you believe in that thought process that like the sun kind of fries your brain after a while, or no? I mean, I definitely think there is some merit to that argument, but I don't think that I don't think that like there's enough scientific thought to like back it up. But like there is like a definite effect that it has on you.
Yeah, definitely. There's something called heat exhaustion.
Well, I knew about heat exhaustion, but I'm saying like the sun like actually having like a negative effect, but like exhaustion, like that's a thing that happens. Like that's bound to happen. Like your muscles, your brain is a muscle. It gets tired after a while. But I'm talking like it actually like having like a deteriorating effect on your brain. I mean, as you get older, like that's just bound to happen, you know, because your body stops working after a while and it starts falling apart. Well, I promise this wasn't supposed to be the human anatomy podcast, but hey, that's the beauty of it. We just kind of talk about whatever, and it will always somehow inevitably lead into our topic of discussion.
Yeah, and I definitely think that I'm no scientist, of course. I'm no doctor,
me neither. I'm the last person that should be talking about this kind of stuff.
I know the way the sun makes me feel after I'm in it for a long time, and my brain gets tired. And all I know is what I know.
Exactly. So. Same with me.
I've only walked my own path. But
I feel like that's a little bit of a problematic statement, considering just how many people operate without like actual scientific knowledge and only go based off of what they know. But like you're like a reasonably common sense kind of guy. Like you need a little bit of correction here and there, but for the most part, you have a decent amount of common sense. So
I try to always learn and be a student and you know, grow. So maybe that factors into it. But
I hope
all I can say is that whenever I'm out there in a long hot day, I am tired and I do not want to think about anything when I'm done with that.
I get that. And
maybe there's something there.
It also probably has something to do with the fact that you work in a place that is like probably like one of the worst places to possibly work when it comes to weather like this. But you know where else it's hot, Chris? And this is going to be like, I'm already sizing you guys up. This is going to be like the worst transition point segue that we've ever had on the show. You know where else it's hot right now?
I have a guess.
And I think you already know the answer to it.
Staten Island?
Yeah, right? Big shocker there.
Oh, wow. This is a very tired one, huh?
Yeah, this is what we're going to call the heat exhaustion episode. I don't think it'll be quite as bad as the gas leak episode of Community, but even still. So
I don't think any of us are this heat exhausted where we're gonna, tattoo on like a 9-year-old kid, but we're certainly shocked.
That's not the result of. I don't think that's the result of heat exhaustion. I think
that's
the result of stupidity and way too much weed smoked in the average span of like 24 years. But the point being, there's not a whole lot of common sense that goes into that decision overall. So
really worked out for his mom, but hey, we can get there.
I don't know about that. That's the question. But so Chris, I mean, it's bad. The place where you live is bad when even New Jersey looks down on you. I'm sorry, I had to retcon that joke because that was like one of the funniest jokes in this movie. So people, welcome back to the heat exhaustion episode of the Talkin TV podcast, the halfway between critics and commentators. I'm still working on it, but we discussed it on the Toy Story 3 watch along, which if you guys haven't gotten a chance to go check that out, it was a pretty great watch along. We had on some great some old people, some new people. It was a pretty fun time. And so if you guys should definitely check that out if you're just a fan
watch
of watch
along with our past selves. And also a few weeks back we did a really fun Jurassic World roast / watch along. I want to say.
Let's face it, that was basically a roast session at this point. Like half the time we weren't even talking about the actual movie. So
no, we weren't.
No, not at all.
Rightfully so.
But this week we've got like a little bit of a different thing just on the podcast side of things. Chris was unfortunately unable to make it last week when we did our episode for I Know This Much Is True, which is currently airing on HBO and was shot in our hometown. If you guys get a chance, you should definitely check that out. But be forewarned, that's not a show that you watch just for like, your typical fun summer entertainment. But this movie that we're talking about today is exactly that, because not only is it a very funny movie, not only is it a movie that is kind of a throwback to a lot of comedies of yesteryear, but also kind of a capitulation encapsulation, if you will, of kind of everything that I kind of want comedies to be now. But it's unfortunate because we're not going to get that, because comedies tank. If there's one thing that 2019 taught us, it's that comedies tank at the box office. So if anything, this kind of ended up being a blessing in disguise for this movie that we're here to talk about today, which is, Chris, what are we talking about today on the Talkin TV channel?
Yeah, today we are talking all things The King of Staten Island, the new Judd Apatow film.
And see, while most people would regard Pete Davidson in this movie as the King of Staten Island, I wouldn't regard him as the King of Staten Island, but I would definitely regard him as the King of 2020, because within the course of a few months, this guy went from being just yet another disposable face on SNL. It's funny because all those faces kind of blend together for me after a while, to being the star, basically, of two of my favorite movies of this year, which I'll admit, the one movie, that being Big Time Adolescence, well, I'll admit there was a lot of bias towards me for that movie because that movie was shot up by where I went to school. But it's funny because Pete Davidson is not the type of guy that you would consider to have like two of like the most, I wouldn't say the most successful, but two of, to me, like the best quality wise movies of the year. Especially when you consider, like, up until a few months ago, the best thing that he was known for was being the guy who dated Ariana Grande. So much so that he even made it a joke in several SNL sketches that he was in. But like, Chris, maybe you can kind of answer this for me. Like, where do you think the appeal for this guy comes from? I think I have an answer for it, but I want to hear your thought process on it first. What is it that the people see in Pete Davidson?
Yeah, I was going to say it's got to be the people, because I don't particularly see much from this guy. Now, that's different from, he can have a good performance every now and then, and we'll get into that when we really start the discussion on this movie. But to me, I think SNL hasn't been great for quite some time. And I think when you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, this is kind of what you find. I think there's talent in the kid. I just don't think he's as much of a comedian as he thinks he is, and as his agents and his people think that he is. I think he was way more in tune to this role, which was, I'd say, dramedy, like that modern term that's kind of being thrown around in the recent years. And I think that this is kind of where he shined, because he has a comedic delivery. But if you watch, I've watched his most recent stand-up special in preparation for this episode, and just to because I knew Pete Davidson was going to be a heavy part of this conversation. Yeah, it's as much as it is a Judd Apatow film, this is equally a Pete Davidson film.
No, this is, again, I would argue even more, this is his movie, much more so than Apatow.
Because it's not a biopic, but it is very much so influenced and based off Pete Davidson's life. But I don't think he really is found. I don't think he has found his voice yet as a creative person. I mean, he's young. We're all young, and he's around our age, but in the limelight, developing in the limelight, So maybe there is still a good comedian inside of him. I haven't really enjoyed his stand-up comedy. I haven't liked much of what he's done. I think SNL has been, going downhill, for a lack of a better term, for quite some time now. But this is actually something that gave me hope. So it's either, what do people see in him, Dom, to answer your question? It's either that our standards have been so low because SNL does these low-hanging fruit jokes, and if they can get a Trump laugh, they get half of America to laugh nowadays. And that, regardless of how I feel about politics, I mean, those are the facts, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So I think that it's a factor of all that, and it's a factor of him being in the celebrity limelight. If you watch his most recent stand-up special, a lot of it is about being dumped by Ariana Grande, and so there's the gossip aspect to it. So that's kind of why I feel like this is the first real, and I haven't seen Big Time Adolescence, so you could speak more to that, but this is, for me, my first real taste of his artistry, and I liked it, but it took a while to get here.
Yeah.
So I don't really know what his appeal is. I
100% agree, because the whole thing with me is you pretty much took the words right out of my mouth, where I've been hearing about this guy nonstop from a couple of other people. But again, the whole thing with me is that the point being is my mom knew who he was because he dated Ariana Grande. And I'm like, okay, I only saw him in one thing, because he's been in a couple of movies popping up in the last couple of years, and I saw him in one thing, ironically enough, one of the worst movies that I saw last year, that Motley Crue movie, The Dirt, where he played their manager, and he could not be more out of place in that movie. That was a movie I'm like, okay, you're a big name, but why are you here? You have no no placement here. And it wasn't the situation where like the main four guys from Motley Crue who were like trying, they just like had terrible material to work with. He just looked out of place, but like physically, like just his performance, he looked out of place. And I watched a couple of his sketches on SNL, and it was nothing that really impressed me. And I think the only thing that I saw is I saw a couple of interviews with him on The Breakfast Club talking to Charlemagne, where he was like, I'm like, okay, I kind of get where the appeal of this comes from. I think it's the fact that he's such a down-to-earth kind of a guy, and a lot of his humor is just matter of fact, right? Like, he's very obvious that he does a lot of drugs. He looks like a guy who does a lot of drugs. And it just, I think the other thing too is his overall look, because he's got one of those looks that it's like, he kind of looks, I made a lot of jokes about how he looks like, a couple probably a little bit more harsh than it should, but I think it's a thing. He looks like a combination between like a Muppet and a mutant. Like, he doesn't look normal. Like, he's got those big bug eyes. He looks way too skinny to actually look healthy. He's covered in tattoos, right? Like, he looks like kind of, he looks like strange. And I think that's kind of where the appeal comes from, because I don't think there's really anybody else that kind of looks like him, but he's so like casual and nonchalant and matter of fact that I'm like, okay, I can see where he has the potential to be funny, but like everything that they're trying to stick this guy with is just not working. And then I watched that movie Big Time Adolescence, which was shot up by me. And I remember because the whole thing was that the production company American High that made that movie came to my school my last semester. I kind of did like this big standing ovation thing for like the Com Festival that we had up there. And I remember of all the trailers that they showed for all the movies that they were producing, Big Time Adolescence was the only one that looked like even remotely like watchable. And then I watched the movie and I'm like, oh no, this movie's actually really good. And what that movie did is that movie kind of used him as like, he wasn't the lead of that movie. He was one of the co-leads of that movie, but he wasn't like the lead of that movie. The main lead was Griffin Gluck. And it was kind of, it was a really interesting kind of take on how like kind of, even though you're friends with this one person who might seem like your guy, your go-to outside of like everything that's normal, like that's not always like the best influence, you know? And I think the movie did a really good job of that. But what I knew, but I even back then, I'm like, okay, this is the kind of like a precursor for what's coming next, because I'd heard about this movie, The King of Staten Island, because I think it was announced like about a year ago, I want to say, because Apatow, I think this is the longest gap that's been between Apatow's movies, because his last movie was Trainwreck, which was with Amy Schumer, which was 5 years ago. And I know that even though Amy Schumer, which I wouldn't say that Amy Schumer, Pete Davidson, I wouldn't compare, because the whole thing is that Amy Schumer's shtick is that she's just unlikable. People don't like her. But with Pete Davidson, it's more so a matter of just like, people don't really know what to make of it because he hasn't really done anything that actually makes him stand out yet. But when I found out that Apatow was doing the next movie, and it was basically kind of the same thing as Trainwreck, where it was like kind of like a semi-autobiographical movie about him, I was like, okay, this could actually be somewhat good. And obviously then COVID happened, and Apatow to me made the very smart choice of deciding to drop this movie direct to VOD, because he kind of saw the writing on the wall and also realized it's like, hey, even if I wait to put this movie out in theaters, like, this is not going to be the movie that people go to, you know? And it's just that's part of a larger conversation just about the nature of which movies are going to succeed at the theater, and whether just like even theaters will succeed once we're on the far side of this Corona thing right now. But my whole thing is that like after watching this movie, I'm like, yeah, this is something different. This is something really special. So if we're just going to dive into the movie first and kind of we'll factor that back into our conversation on Pete. So the movie, The King of Staten Island, directed by Judd Apatow, stars Pete Davidson as Scott, a 24-year-old, basically like dropout, stoner, loser, bum, washout, like every single type of term that you could attribute to that sort of thing. He's living with his mom. His younger sister is going away to college for the first time, and he's still on the fast track to doing nothing with his life. He does nothing but hang out and smoke weed with his friends all day, who are next to him like brainless as the second. It's kind of one of those Seinfeld situations where you kind of know you're an idiot, so you surround yourself with dumber people just to make yourself feel smarter for sheer fact of that. And some things obviously start to change in his life when his mom, portrayed by Marisa Tomei, starts seeing a guy played by Bill Burr. And it kind of starts to create some real changes in his life, and kind of is starting to force him to actually like reconsider his position in his life and stop depending on the crutch that is his dad. Because his go-to in this movie is the fact that his dad was a firefighter who died in a fire recently, which is also obviously a very direct reference to Davidson's real life struggles of losing his dad in 9/11. So right off the bat, right there, if we could just dive into this movie, I think that this movie has that edge in terms of being super relatable and super heartwarming in that sense, you know, because it's kind of it's a situation that we've seen before from both Apatow and from a lot of other comedies. The idea of the man-child and making the man-child relatable, you know? It's a thing that I know a lot of people like, a lot of people don't like, but when it's done right, it can give us some really, really good movies.
Yeah, I think this movie was going to go one of two ways. It was going to either be really good or really bad. And I think to a lot of people, it is very much so divisive in that sense because, you know, it's hard to be accepting of these kind of people. Just when you see them in real life, you judge them really quick. Like you said,
like immediately.
Looks like, you know, what did you say? Like a Muppet and a mutant, right?
A Muppet / mutant. It's like they had a love child together.
I know you're just kidding, and I know whatever, he's not going to hear this, but
no. And even if he did, he wouldn't care.
But that's like a very harsh thing to say. But also, when you get tattooed like that, when you do that amount of drugs, your body does look a certain way. When you go around touting those things, you do have that certain kind of stigma. So people were already prejudging Pete Davidson coming into this film just based off like what we've seen about him in the tabloids. If you're into that kind of thing with the whole Ariana Grande situation, or just like his stand-up special where he's just so open about how much copious amounts of mushrooms he does in his basement. So like he already has like this stigma. So you're going to judge him regardless. And that's why this film is either you love it because you can accept him as an actor in this role and as this character and kind of get past like all of the drama around him, because he's like one of those guys that like he's got that buzz, that BuzzFeed buzz where everyone's like, oh God, Pete Davidson said this, he did that. He kind of it could taint his art a little bit, but since this was so true to him as a person, I think he gets away with it. But also I think this kind of person is very off-putting to a lot of people. So I thought that he did a great job in this role. I thought that he certainly carried the film, but I think like the supporting cast also kind of, because there was some awkward lulls, there really was some awkward interactions that Pete has. And so I think the supporting cast really complimented him very well, which to me makes this part of a big success because again, like he's a polarizing guy to begin with, and then you put him in his life story. Well, there's not much of a difference there because he's already a polarizing guy.
It's basically the Pete Davidson. It's basically the Pete Davidson biopic. And again, it's funny because the whole thing is that like previously it's these types of movies would be called self-indulgent, but given the amount of just biopics about like really famous people from back in the day that have been to me like way more self-indulgent than like anything else, like and untrue too, to add to that, like we just recently obviously with kind of the music biopic subgenre being kind of tainted by shit like Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man, to the point where and then you got like that weird pseudo offshoot last year. The music
genre has their whole Marvel formula starting to be
that's a whole separate argument. And like Patrick H. Williams already did a great
I know what you're saying. Yeah,
video
exactly.
breaking down why music biopics don't work.
I understand why you go there though.
But the whole thing is that this is basically a biopic without actually being a biopic. And in that sense, it really works because if you're looking at this as Pete Davidson's life story, it works 100%. And also on top of that, it's just like a really funny, entertaining movie.
So that's true. And I agree with all that. But because it's so close to who Pete Davidson is as an actual person, even though it's not technically a biopic, even though it is just heavily inspired and based around his life, I think it is hard for a lot of people who kind of don't analyze this stuff like you and I do at this deep level to separate that at first glance. So I think, like, again, it's going to be one of those films that you either really love or you either really hate. It's definitely not one of those, like, it was a good film, I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the best,
But the good thing is that, at least from what I've heard, a majority of the people who I've seen who have watched this movie love it. Like, I don't think there's been a single person who has, and even, like, the people who haven't liked it are just the ones that are like, they're nitpicking for the sake of being nitpicky. It's like, come on, like, you don't actually have a problem with this. You're doing this so that you can try and sound intelligent, So, like,
with this movie, a lot of people that I interact with, again, that are just like common people who don't analyze this stuff like us, who don't have a YouTube channel, they think it's really my small circle, right? The people I've spoken with at my job and my friend group. A lot of people found it was very insensitive. They found that it was just a bad message about, mental health because he kind of just like whatever's his way through everything. And even when he does get like a little bit of inspiration, he's still just like half-assing it, for lack of a better word. But then a lot of people who in this commentation world that we are in, Dom, like, the critics and whatnot that we talk to and hang out with, they love it. So that to me, I'm coming into this thinking like I have my own opinions, but it's just fascinating to see how everyone is either on this side of the fence or that side of the fence, and there's no middle ground.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is the fact that I love how you broke down like the kind of the difference between like critics and real world people, because that's like, again, like it feels like with every big movie now, there has to be some sort of divide. Sometimes where there doesn't even need to be a divide in it, you know, where you get something like this. And again, critics are going to like it because it's a well done story. You know, obviously it's Apatow, and every Apatow movie is going to be problematic. You know, it's funny. I've heard this common argument, which is that every single Apatow movie is like 10 minutes, it's like 15 minutes too long, you know? And I'm like, sure, you could trim the fat. And I'll admit, it is definitely like, he is definitely a guy who values a lot of improv, you know? And you can see that in every single one of his movies. You know, like I said, we were talking about this before. Apatow was kind of like the father of like kind of our genre of comedy that we knew growing up. Consider the fact that between being the co-producer of Freaks and Geeks, the fact that he like produced every single major comedy of like the last 10 to 12 years that we love, the fact that he gave that without him, we would not have guys like Seth Rogen, Jonah Hill, Bill Hader, Danny McBride. All those guys owe their start to Judd Apatow. And it's funny because it's a 1-2 sword. It's kind of a double-edged sword because it's like the things that you love about Apatow are also some things that like people hate about Apatow. So like when you bring up this idea of critics versus audience members not liking that, because this is the first time also that I've heard audience members not liking this movie, at least, because like I said, everybody who I've talked to has really, really enjoyed it. I find that interesting, how kind of usually it's kind of regular people that like something for reasons that critics don't. Like critics might find something insensitive, while regular people like kind of don't really care about that. But that's interesting that you bring that up, how critics for the most part really love it and really, really enjoy it, but how regular people might find it insensitive because of its portrayal of mental health, which is funny because to me, like, I actually think this is a great portrayal of mental health, you know, because everybody has different ways of doing this. But like, I know for a fact that I saw elements of myself in that character, like obviously not to the extent, but like I've done things that like the character of Scott has done before, you know?
Yeah, I mean, he is very real, this character. And I think that that's another reason why, at least in my small circle, again, it's just my interactions daily. I'm not, going to YouTube and reading thousands of comments and gathering a sample size here. I just, my interactions in my day-to-day. I think that's why he's so polarizing. And I think it's funny that you kind of bring up that Apatow, people like to say like, oh, this could have been left out or he could have done this differently. His movies do sort of, I guess, allow that conversation to happen just by the nature of him and his style as a director.
Right.
So I think it's so funny that his lead in this film in specific is also such a polarizing guy that people either kind of love or hate.
Right. And what's funny also is that because again, this character of Scott, portrayed by Pete Davidson, is the latest, because every single Apatow protagonist, with the exception of, I would say, Paul Rudd, and this is 40, but this is 40 is a weird situation because that's where he decided to do a spin-off around like the funny supporting character from Knocked Up. It's like he decided that was like him trying to capitalize on like his most popular movie at the time, which was Knocked Up. But if you look at every single movie that he's done, other than that, like they're all about people who, I don't want to say man-children, because that man-child is only a thing that he's examined in like a couple of different things. That's something that I would much more so attribute to like a Will Ferrell or like an Adam McKay kind of a comedy, mostly because Will Ferrell was pretty much in every one of Adam McKay's comedies that he did, which is that it's always, Apatow loves making movies about people. And this is why I always give him more credit than he deserves, because his movies are never straight comedies. Like Apatow was doing dramedies before the term dramedy was popular, was like a popular word in the zeitgeist. And what's interesting is that every single one of Apatow's protagonists always had like a form of maturity that they had to reach, even if it didn't seem like it. Like the obvious example go to is Seth Rogen from Knocked Up, obviously being like, needed to mature and being a man-child. And obviously the only way that he did that was he literally got a girl pregnant and had to like actually learn how to grow and mature and like actually form a stable relationship. And while that's not the same thing here with Pete Davidson in this movie, it's similar because Pete Davidson's whole thing is he just needs to like just learn how to grow up and actually start taking some responsibility, And obviously it's different because 40-year-old virgin, with Steve Carell, he's like a pretty stable guy aside from the fact that like he just hasn't had sex, and it's just like that's just like a whole world of like the adult zeitgeist that he just like hasn't touched in yet. And it's kind of actually really fascinating. And I don't think all the jokes in that movie land, but it's still like the overall, the underlying core struggle is there. And even with something as funny people, which is like his most underrated movie, where he takes arguably probably one of the most pretentious subject matters being, a stand-up comedian who thinks he's not funny anymore, and as a result is starting to have a midlife crisis. Like, that's not a relatable premise to somebody like us at all. But that's like might be one of his best movies, you know?
Yeah, real quick side note, 40-Year-Old Virgin is aging in a very weird way, in my opinion.
Yeah,
But
it's really interesting.
That's neither here nor there, because I want to take it back to, and this comes from kind of what you just touched upon right there. You said in the beginning of this thing, like, it's a funny movie. I don't think this movie really is that funny, even though it is a comedy. But I also think that there's two types of comedies, you know? Well, more than two, but the two on the big screen that I flock to and that I enjoy are the ones like Anchorman, where it's like laugh out loud funny. You're there with your friends. It's ridiculous. It's zany. It's all over the place. But then you also have like the more, you know, thoughtful comedies, the ones where it's like for example, in this movie, so many times I thought, I want to chuckle, but I also feel terrible for what he's going through right now. Like, for example, in the opening sequence, I picked up on the humor pretty quickly. I'm a dark comedy guy, been really going down the Ricky Gervais rabbit hole lately, so I get it, you know. But I was still, when they're in that opening sequence, he's in that basement hanging out with his friends. They're smoking, they're drinking, and they're all making fun of his dead dad. And I'm like, oh God! Like I want to laugh,
but like
because I know that's supposed to make you laugh.
That sets the tone right away, because the movie
sets the tone. But I think it also sets the feeling of this divisiveness that I've come across when I've spoken about it with people. So it's such a weird beast, this film, to talk about. Yeah, because it's like they deliver you the feeling that you're going to be getting predominantly throughout the rest of the film right away. So you are well acquainted with what you're getting into, but it's so interesting to see how it just makes so many different people feel. You know, that's the thing about dark comedy.
And the funny thing about that is, what you would call dark comedy, I would actually call like pretty light nature. Like, because the whole thing about that is that just felt like relatable. You know, like I think this more so than like any of Apatow's other movies. This to me, like, because all of Apatow's other movies, even though they were very, very down to earth and like how they were shot and how they were presented and like how they were characterized, this to me like felt way more down to earth than any of them. And maybe that's because he's finally dealing with people that are like of our generation. So that's like way more relatable in that sense. But almost as soon as this movie gets kicked off, you know exactly what kind of a ride you're in for. And it's very interesting, because this is a thing that I've talked about with a lot of people recently, about the idea of tension in movies and where it comes from. And obviously there's all different sorts of tension, but like you and me have talked about it. It's like the best types of tension in movies are the one where it's like razor thin wire, the clock is constantly ticking, the character has to get their thing done before they're running out of time. And I feel like the reason why comedy as a genre has been so hit or miss is because comedies for the most part don't do that. Comedies were kind of hitting this idea of comfort food long before like TV ever became a thing. You know, that's why kind of the idea of the sitcom has been an idea that's been so kind of divisive lately, because yes, when it works, it works. The problem is it's very easy for comedies to become reliant on a formula and get stuck in kind of this never-ceasing loop, this never-ending loop that doesn't allow for as much growth or change or development. And in terms of my personal stance on comedy, I've been a very big proponent of the fact that yes, only certain things will make me laugh. And I'll fully attribute that to the fact that I didn't watch a lot of comedies growing up, like, because I was mostly like, I was an animation diehard kid. Like, I watched Pixar or Disney movies, and that was like kind of what schooled me on comedy, you know? So like when I get to like all these like gut-busting chuckle box movies, you know, like if I'm going like, I'm talking like early Todd Phillips and like early Adam McKay and stuff like that, like a lot of that stuff just wasn't funny, because to me, I'm like, it's just like, it's kind of the same reason why like a lot of like broadband humor just doesn't work on me. It's like, it's pratfalls, it's fart jokes, it's like all that different, it's zany characters, but not like zany because they have like a reason for being zany. It's just zany for the sake of being zany. You know, like you called Anchorman zany, but my whole thing with Anchorman is Anchorman was a very zeitgeist movie. It hit kind of at the right time, but when I go back and rewatch that movie, I'm like, it's just characters acting dumb and being random for the sake of being random, which is a thing that is very, very hit or miss for me. My kind of comedy that I like, obviously this idea of meta comedy is something that the internet has kind of ruined and purported, but my favorite kinds of comedy are the comedy that is very subtle, like usually like kind of like background gag kind of jokes, you know, or like straight satire. Sometimes to the point where like the movie itself is not actually supposed to be funny, and you're laughing because so hard because of how like almost kind of scarily realistic it is to real life. You know, like something like an Armando Iannucci thing, almost kind of like something like In the Loop, you know, like that sort of thing. Like the reason to me why Tropic Thunder is quite possibly is my favorite comedy ever, is because that is poking fun at a thing that I love, that being Hollywood and the machinations that dictate some of the crazy decisions that go into making some of the big budget movies that we love, and just like straight up roasting. And that movie's almost like a roast fest of like every single trope that we both love to make fun of about Hollywood, almost to the point where that movie is arguably more relevant now than it was when it came out in 2008. But the thing that I like about this movie is that this movie is kind of tackling something that we talked about a little bit on our episode where we talked about Space Force, which is the idea of comedy kind of being the horror genre, where most broadband comedies that succeed now are stuck in this never-ending loop and cycle and are constantly reliant on these tropes that do not allow for a lot of experimentation and allow for a lot of like very repetitive humor, and it causes the movies to not be as funny as they could be. And this, to me, this movie, and why I enjoy it so much, was because it was a step in the right direction. Because yes, it's very funny, but it's also super dark. It's very, very upfront and brutally honest about its issues, to the point where it is unlikable. I guess the divisiveness comes from the fact that the characters are not likable at all. Like almost notoriously, but like they're not supposed to be. And the movie, to me, very much is about human beings. And to me, so much of comedies that people like are about like distancing like your association with these human beings, because you just want to like laugh at them, you know? But really, to me, like, again, the magic of movies that I talked about comes from your ability to connect with the characters that you watch. And this is the first comedy in a long time where I've actually been able to form that connection.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, even though I had like those moments where should I laugh, should I not laugh, I enjoy that feeling though, because to me, whenever I have that feeling, I think a lot of what you hear guys like Joe Rogan speaking about, specifically, he had, Bill Burr on, he had Jimmy O Yang on, and Kevin Hart on recently, all comedians. And at some point in the conversation, it all comes up where it's like, well, we're kind of afraid, not really, but we're thinking about what we're going to say now because we don't want to get canceled or how we're going to say it. Whereas in the past, we would push the envelope. We would give you that feeling of like, should I say this? And I got that in this movie. And I like that. That sting is a part of comedy, that, hey, we're going to take something that we should not joke about right now, and we're going to try and make it funny, because that's what comedians before us have done. And that's what comedians after us hopefully will continue to do, because that is comedy. Not everyone's type of comedy, but a lot of people like to take that current event comedy and push the envelope for it. Yeah. And I personally am a fan of that. Now, I think this is a good time.
I like it when it's done right, but the problem is when it's shoved in your face over and over again. That's when it gets like, I'm like, okay, we get it. Like you made the same 50. You've made the same. I've heard these 50 same Trump jokes over and over again. What else do you got?
Yes, and I also agree with that. But I think like we need more innocent attempts like this to just be allowed to happen. Yeah. Because let's like dive in and get a little more specific now. But I think, this film obviously had some moments that weren't that great. And this isn't a perfect film by any means, but at least it showed it wasn't afraid to be a comedy in 2020. And I'll give it that. I give it a lot. But one of the main things I'll give it, because I did really enjoy this film, but it's just its fearlessness in a time where you kind of have to, as a comedian, as a comedic director, a comedic actor, really you're combating like half of the internet when you go out on a limb and take a risky joke, like talking about someone who died tragically in a fire. I mean, that I don't know how people aren't upset about that right now.
Notice how they definitely had to change it from how he actually died, which was in 9/11. Obviously, like there's no way they were put that kind of a joke in this movie.
Yeah, and so like I think I respect this film for that. But just to dive more into it, I think a lot of what worked in this film wasn't just like the writing, but it was the casting and the people they had in these roles, and more specifically how good of a straight man Bill Burr showed that he could be to Pete Davidson's kind of. And these guys weren't, it's not like Will Ferrell funny. We've already established that. It's like tasteful funny. You have to think about that, and it's going to maybe sting you a little bit if you're a little more of a sensitive soul, or if you really have those demons in you, you're going to laugh, but you at least know why you're laughing. But I think that they were a really good duo in a sense. Not that they were together the entirety of the film. Pete Davidson kind of spent a little bit of time with everyone, but I really thought that their pairing was the strongest, especially because they're both like stars in their own right. So I was curious as to how they were going to mesh up and sort of kind of help this story. Because as an actor, your goal is to help the story be impactful and help, and have an emotive quality for the audience. So that's one of the things. But like, what was your take on that? Was one of the things that really kind of spoke to me, was like, cool, these guys are not just doing their stand-up routines here. They're not just, Bill Burr is not just giving you who he is on his podcast. He's bringing something new to this performance. So I was really impressed with both of these comedians coming in who I haven't seen act much.
Well, my whole thing, first off, if we could just get back to the comedy routine, like, I absolutely get where stand-up comics are coming from, but in the same sense, I think that the problem that they're having too, and it's a problem that I think it's why I feel like so many stand-up comedians kind of had a hard time kind of adjusting it, is, to me, it's not the sense of like you're unable to make risque jokes, because if anything, like, if you look at Chappelle, like, Chappelle has proved that you can still do like risque jokes over and over again. It's a matter of kind of weighing the field and understanding what is just people complaining for the sake of complaining and trying to get attention versus like something that's like, oh no, that's like actually, different, like to me, like, there's a big difference between cracking a joke about somebody who's Chinese but like giving like a thoughtful, provocative reason as to why without just coming off as insensitive versus just straight up like making like derogatory, blatantly racist jokes for the sake of being racist, like, and yeah, it definitely like joke making in general does require a lot more thought. But I guess if anything, to me, like, it kind of, it makes it a little bit more like interesting, because it's like, yeah, now that comedians actually have to, think rather than saying what they think sounds funny, it could potentially give us like some much better jokes, So that's kind of my whole thought process on that, is it like, if actually thinking provides us with some better jokes and some better overall humor, then good for them, because so much, like I said, so much of why I have a problem with just generalized broad humor is the fact that it is very lazy and very repetitive and doesn't actually require a lot of thought. But in terms of how they kind of apply that standard to this movie, especially in a movie where the two leads are known more so for their stand-up comedy rather than their acting chops, I gotta say, I don't know like where they have been this whole time, but like they both, like Davidson and Burr, as far as their performances go, are like top notch. Like two of my favorite performances of the year so far. Like, I'll say this, like Davidson, again, he's still very new, but Davidson so far has kind of fallen into the same track of where between both Big Time Adolescents and this movie, it's a very easy type of a performance because he's basically playing himself. He's basically just sitting there in front of the camera and he's basically like, oh, it's just me, like that, and that's literally him, because that's how he sounds in real life, So and I don't want to take away anything from his performance, but again, the whole point of this movie is that it is semi-autobiographical, So I just want that to be first and well known. But with Bill Burr, like, you want to talk about a guy, it's like, yeah, you're watching Bill Burr, but at the same time, like, he gets so into character, and he, like, his mannerisms are just so approachable, and like you legitimately feel like you're watching like an earnest guy, because this to me is like probably the most earnest and genuine that Bill Burr has ever had to be, and you could tell that like there's a real pain and a tragedy in there underneath him, and because these are both characters that are both dealing with a lot of damage, a lot of internal damage. Like I said, that's Apatow's specialty. He specializes in characters that are a lot more damaged than they appear. It kind of allows him to form this like really kind of awesome connection, especially obviously given the fact of like their shared, with Bill Burr being a firefighter and Davidson's dad dying in a fire. It creates some like really interesting conflict and actually creates some like really both funny and kind of sad lines too. Like the scene to me where him and Bill Burr go to the baseball game where they're chilling with all of Bill Burr's other firefighter buddies. And
David Buscemi gets first introduced.
Yeah, and David, well, that's the scene where Davidson has that monologue where he's like, yeah, firefighters shouldn't have kids because when they die, like they leave like their families behind. And like not one of these other firefighters can disagree with him because he's 100% right, like all of that stuff. It's like, it's not funny per se, but again, it's just like in his delivery, like he makes it so natural. So yeah, I guess kind of.
But I just kind of want to jump in there because when I was listening back to the I Know This Much Is True episode that you guys did last week, and great job on that, by the way, in my absence, you guys kind of brought up this interesting point of like a breadcrumb trail. And this movie, I think, did an excellent job sort of bringing you to the finale in the sense that they set that moment up where they're at the baseball field and, Steve Buscemi is trying to get the message across, but he inevitably gives up because at that point in time, Pete Davidson's character seems like a lost cause. And well, quite honestly, he is at that point in the movie. But then, tragedy strikes and he goes to the only place that would take him in, which is the firehouse. And so they kind of hinted at that moment that we get to when they're in the bar and they're drinking and they're singing that One Headlight song by Bob Dylan's son's band. I forget the name of the band right now, but that was so funny that they don't know the words, they know the one line like everyone else. But then they have that very sincere and almost like cerebral conversation where the energy of the drinking's out and they're just the last few people that stuck around from their big party are there, and he's saying like, you know, like it's, you should still have a family. And Steve Buscemi kind of realizes he's ready to hear those words at that point in time, and Pete Davidson accepts those words, and it's just this really organic growth process because the breadcrumb trail, the pieces that are being picked up are so well done in this film, and
it's good storytelling is what it is.
It's really good storytelling. I really think I want to read this screenplay. I want to see it on paper because I think there's got to be a magic in those pages, because it's just, there are some things that I think, and we can certainly get there, we're a little loose, a little rough around the edges, but for the most part, this thing is really airtight. And I think that's kind of why it, like you said, and this is why I wanted to jump in, Dom, because you said it feels like you're watching Bill Burr, but you know it's Bill Burr, but you also know he's playing this character.
Right.
Yeah, it does. It does, because I think that's just Bill Burr and that's a part of his charm. But this screenplay is just such a good roadmap for these guys who are kind of getting used to trying something new. You know, I haven't seen Bill Burr do much acting outside of The Mandalorian, and I know that for him and Pete Davidson, this is newer for their careers. But this screenplay really helps them bring what they brought to the table in their other, you know, their podcasts and their stand-up routines, the things that they're good at, while also trying new things. And so it does feel like you're watching Bill Burr play Bill Burr, but simultaneously, what was his name? Frank? Was that his name? The character he plays?
Yeah, I
Bill
think
Burr?
so. Yeah.
Frank,
I
Kevin,
wanna
whatever.
say,
It's a
I
very
think
bland
so.
name, but it also feels like
Yeah.
you're watching not Bill Burr at the same time. And it's just like, this movie has me feeling all different types of ways, because it's just, again, when you have a good screenplay, I think you can really analyze it and pick it apart because there's so much to talk about, you know?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the Steve Buscemi monologue, because first of all, Steve Buscemi is a guy who people forget, because the problem is, the thing about Steve Buscemi is because he's been in so many movies and he's played such a wide variety of parts, people almost forget what a good actor he is. And that monologue that he had where he's talking about Pete Davidson's dad, I'm like, that is the best acting that I've seen from him, like, since Boardwalk, like, in years. And the other thing, and the other reason why that was so earnest too, is that Steve Buscemi, before he was an actor, was a firefighter. I actually think that he was one of the first responders in 9/11. So you got that going for you. You got that little connection also. But it's a situation where, to me, again, we talked about this ad nauseum, where another element of good screenplay, good storytelling, good character development is the fact of where every character that's involved in the screenplay has this connection to the main character and gives them a different perspective that allows them to grow and change, you know? And this movie had that, which is something that, to me, like, not a lot of movies do anymore, you know? It's kind of like that one thing that they missed, but this movie had that, where it's like every single person, his mom, his sister, the girl that he's sleeping with, Bill Burr, Steve Buscemi, all of his moron friends, you know, each and every single one of those characters helps contribute to his growth and development. And again, like you were saying, it's good storytelling. It's a good screenplay. Yeah, it's funny. And yeah, it's got like a lot of great jokes. And like, we could talk about like some of our favorite jokes later, because I have a few, but like how it sets things up and pays them off. Like, it's everything that a good screenplay is supposed to do. And the problem is that because so many movies now, I feel like are so spectacle based, you almost forget that, like, when you get something like this, it almost kind of like seems like an anomaly when it shouldn't, because this is how every movie used to be.
I'm glad you said that, because I was someone who had to do a double take on, I know this much is true. I don't love it, but I don't dislike it as much as I did. I never would use the word hate, but I don't dislike it as much as I did. And so I was wondering if I kind of fell victim to the whole Marvel big spectacle film, because we've been covering those so much.
Certainly very easy to do, trust me.
And we've been talking about them so much lately, and there's a certain like level of stimulation that just is built into that formula, that you don't have to try to find something in it. They're just going to spoon feed you the whole time. So I was almost a little worried going into this. Like, am I tell myself I am, but am I able to get something out of this type of movie, this slower, more traditionalist style, obviously with the modern twists, the character being a millennial and all that. But I was really glad that I was, because I think that there has been not an issue of me and this style connecting, but an issue of this style of film being good in such a long time that it makes me feel for this character the way I did. I don't stay up late anymore. I was up till 3 a.m. watching this. It is a fairly long movie.
Yeah.
And when I turned it on, I just knew I couldn't stop because I had to see this in one sitting.
Yep.
It was that just consuming.
Yeah.
And I think this movie, I don't think it's getting enough credit. I think it is very important. I think it shows that we can still have these kind of narrative driven films. And I don't really know, man, why we're not getting more of these, you know?
Yeah.
Like
because again, this is how every movie that was made, like the 90s had a run of movies that were just like this. And the problem is that like now, because every movie that does, it's the same reason why comedies just don't do well in the theaters anymore, because every movie now has to be a spectacle. Like that's the only movies that people actually like going to see in theaters. And it's disappointing because yeah, spectacles are good. And yeah, they provide for some really entertaining movies. But again, it goes back to the Scorsese argument all over again. When that's all that you get, you know, you start to become bored by that. And don't get me wrong, a lot of spectacles, I think the other thing too that's kind of got lost in the shuffle is the fact that some of our favorite spectacles, like you look at the Lord of the Rings movies, which are like kind of the pinnacle of spectacle fantasy storytelling, those all have still those base elements of storytelling, like the shot composition, the screenplay structure, you know, like the pacing for like the thing that makes the Lord of the Rings movies compelling that you go back to over and over again is not like the slaughtering orcs over and over again. It's that for 3 hours a piece, those movies are so tightly paced, and every single part of those movies matter towards the overall narrative, you know? And that to me is a thing that has kind of been lost, because even with the Marvel movies now, the problem is the Marvel movies, again, which is the thing that people have given is like, the credit is like, oh, they finally got superhero continuity right. To me, it's like the problem with those movies, a big problem that I have with those movies is that half the interesting stuff that is supposed to happen happens off screen. And that to me, again, it works from like a comic book medium. And that's kind of the excuse, because the problem is that so much of pop culture now is dominated by comic books. But when it comes to like just a basic storytelling element, that to me is not good storytelling, because to me, a good story is a movie where every single piece matters. Like we just rewatched Toy Story 3 the other night, and even though that's an animated kids movie, that is a movie that is so rock solid with its screenplay, where there was not a single ounce of fat on that movie. There was not one bit of that movie that you would have to cut out, because that movie flows and paces itself. It has a clear-cut beginning, middle, and end. And even though Apatow's movies are often criticized for not having that tight-knit formula, you know, again, the running joke with all of Apatow's movies is that they all seem to be like 20 minutes too long. And yeah, I'll admit, at 2 hours and 17 minutes, this movie is stretching it a little bit. And there are definitely, like, I could point to some very easy scenes. I'm like, cut that.
Yeah,
that just specifically a lot of the scenes with his friends that kind of just felt like improv for the sake of improv's sake, and they didn't really actually contribute anything to the plot. But even with all that being said, like, this movie still had its base bare bones in storytelling and screenplay structure, and it's because Apatow is a guy who knows what he's doing. He knows how to direct this type of material and make something that might seem kind of generic very, very compelling.
Yeah, and I really like how you kind of brought it to Toy Story 3, because that film it's
a masterpiece. It is a modern day masterpiece.
Yeah, it has its spectacle moments, given the Dante Inferno scene that is just this giant moment in this very tiny film.
The movie literally becomes like an escape heist movie in the third act.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, it's justified. And I think a lot of what you see with the MCU and with these bigger spectacle films, just take a few weeks back here on our channel, the Jurassic World watch along, that there was nothing justified about the climax of that film. Sure, it was grandiose. And I remember walking out of that thing and being like, wow, that was something else. That was sick. I liked the spectacle aspect of it, but rewatching that, clearly all of us on that panel had no real takeaways. It's not something that's going to make you think about the emotional qualities behind the spectacle. So that's kind of the thing that I like about this film. It can like talk the talk and walk the walk. It backs itself up. It's not thin. It's not thinly veiled. Yeah, there's some scenes, like you said, I didn't think we needed to get that much of the college party. I didn't think we needed to get them ripping into his dad on the couch that much in the beginning. There is some.
I think you needed that part, because that's very important with the establishment. That part, but there was like a whole 2-minute thing beforehand where I was like, okay, where's this going? And then, okay, now we're learning about his dad. I thought it was a clever exposition, but that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is,
Yes, it's a Judd Apatow movie, so you know there's going to be some things that should have been left on the cutting room floor that aren't. But that's just his style at this point. So you either accept that this far into his career, or you don't. But yeah, I'm really glad you brought it to this whole spectacle thing, because I feel like a lot of people think, oh, well, here's Chris. He doesn't like Disney. He doesn't like the big spectacle. He hates all the new Star Wars. No. I love a good spectacle.
Bad movies.
But I want to leave a film having something to think about, change with a change of perspective, or at least something to consider. I think that's what movies are for, right? They're to enrich you and improve the quality of your life, at least for me. And so
that to me is what movies are about.
This movie backed up its talk. It backed up its walk. Toy Story 3 being more of a spectacle film than this one, there was purpose behind that spectacle. It increased and heightened the narrative arc. So I think there's a right way to do it. And I think that's what I've been saying and what I've been trying to say. And the more I say it, I refine it. So I respect this film for, it has some flaws. It has some things that could have been left on the cutting room floor, but the vision was clear. And I think everything that happened in the film, everything the characters did, that they were put in, the situations that they had to overcome and encounter, especially with Action Bronson at the end being shot, and you know, Pete Davidson,
hilarious.
Davidson going to save him. That was funny. That was that dark comedy. It was a funny moment, but really what it was a justified reason to show this change of character, and it felt so natural, and it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like we were grasping at straws like, oh, well, he has to change because it's a dramedy and that's how these things go. No, it felt like, wow, he really changed this much. Yeah. Like I believed it. Believability again, is what is where I'm ending at here.
The best movies to me, before kind of we wrap this up and do our star rating, the best movies to me are the movies that allow you to almost grow and change with the character without you even realizing it. You know, it's kind of, to me, the biggest difference between this and something like a Spike Lee movie is Spike Lee, his movies really work as a kind of good canvas pieces, but the problem is his movies are so busy hammering their messages into your skull every 3 seconds that you never actually get a chance to enjoy and go along on the journey with those characters, because every 3 seconds he's throwing in a non sequitur. I was like, yeah, white people feel guilty about systemic racism in America that most of you have had no control over, you know? But with something like this movie, it's a situation where, yes, Scott is a screw up. Yes, he does nothing with his life, but it's a situation. And yes, it's a very easy model to make fun of for a character, but it's a situation where, like, as he goes along, you actually like kind of do end up rooting for him and empathizing with him, you know, because that to me is what good movies do. They generate a character who starts off in one place, they have a fatal flaw, and by the end, regardless of whether they've really changed or not as a person, they have overcome that flaw. And to me, like the scene with Action Bronson, I mean, that's only one of many hilarious moments in this movie. I mean, I could go on like this, but that scene kind of capitulates and encapsulates everything that he stands for, you know, and like the firehouse sequences where he's just chilling with the firefighters, that's great. And then finally forming this connection with Bill Burr and those two kind of forming their own connection outside of his mom, you know, and them not having to be connected by his mom, you know, like it's a really well done movie. And just from a comedic standpoint and as a movie, it impressed me.
Yeah, this movie, it's organic in the way that we see Pete Davidson grow. You know, he goes from an hour in going to the ex-wife of Bill Burr's character's house and getting dirt from obviously the most biased source you can go to then sort of, you know, drawing something so beautiful on Bill Burr's back, sort of showing his appreciation. Like, I want you in my family. I put you in a tattoo with my family because I've grown, and it's kind of thanks to our relationship that I've grown, and we needed to get into that fight because we're both better people for it now, you know, and also the innocence of like using children, like him walking those kids and just the growth there, you know.
Great. That was hilarious.
But it wasn't forced. It wasn't forced, and it was very natural. Very forced.
It was just one of those little beautiful moments where as he's like walking along and the kid is like explaining the idea of like his superheroes that he wants to draw. And then like he explains it, and it's like, oh, it's like at first it starts off like an easy joke. It's like, yeah, I mean those powers are cool, but like I could defeat it with a hairdryer, you know, that sort of thing. it's
yeah, like a 24-year-old just debunking the logic of a 9-year-old.
Yeah, but then like later on, as he's showing him, and he shows up with dragons, he's like, oh my god, that's like actually really cool. But like it feels so genuine and earnest, you know, like there's not a single ounce of disingenuous feelings involved in this movie, and it's something that is such a rarity, especially given the fact that Hollywood is like the place where genuine feelings go to die. But Like that it was all over this movie, and I could not have appreciated it more for that. Like this movie, because we talk ad nauseum about how people can't handle brutal honesty, but like this movie was chock full of it. Like every single chance, like that's the whole thing. Like Davidson goes on at the beginning of the movie, and he's like, "Oh my God, when are people going to start giving me a break?" It's like, because you don't deserve it, because you haven't done anything to really deserve a break. As they tell him, they're like, yeah, just because your dad died doesn't mean that you get to coast on that forever. You know, eventually you do have to grow up and move on, you know? But the movie wasn't hammering that home. It was doing it in a way where it's like everybody that said that to him, it felt like how real people would say that to him, you know? Like I've had people have those conversations with me in real life, and it felt like exactly like one of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it really felt like a biopic, and just the believability of these things being so real, because it was just, again, I think we're coming back to this whole breadcrumb trail, which is a sign of a tight knit, well done screenplay if done in this way. And so, yeah, there was its flaws and its faults. And do I think every scene worked? No, but that's easily forgiven, because the charm and just the message and the subtlety, how it didn't feel forced getting to this conclusion, it really was a good ride, and I enjoyed being a part of it. You know, it's rare that you see a movie of this style be this effective this day and age, in my opinion. So I really appreciated it for that, as well as many other things which I've said the last hour.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. So with that being said, we're pretty much on the tail end of this thing. So kind of to wrap it up, The King of Staten Island is a movie that was greatly helped by the fact that we're in Corona right now, so we don't have a lot of things to look forward to. So this was something actually new and interesting that we could look forward to. And then it ended up shocking me, because as somebody who, I'm not going to say has not been the biggest fan of Apatow's movie, but as somebody who is not necessarily as experienced with Apatow's movies as I should be, just given the overall amounts of just my own general thought process towards comedies in general, this surprised me. It was a very pleasant surprise. It was a great coming of age movie. It was a very funny movie, but it was also a very it was a very genuine movie. It was tragic when it needed to be. It was hilarious when it needed to be. The script was rock solid. And this is one of the very few movies that I can say I would recommend for anyone. I'd give this 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. You know, this film was everything that I needed in this point in time. I think the time that it came out also kind of helps, like you said, but I also think like there's just an undeniable charm. And I went into this, like I said early on, with my preconceived notions about Pete Davidson, like I think a lot of people do. But how quickly and how masterfully he was able to defeat those notions and just get me so invested into his character, into his story, into his world. That's when I knew this movie meant business. And it's just got this charm. And yeah, I'm not wrong. I think more of these movies need to be as well done as this one is, because quite frankly, they haven't been working for me lately. So this was a good reassurance of many things for me, and I loved it. I recommend it to anyone. Like you said, it's kind of hard to give my own personal monologue here when you just took the words right out of my mouth, but we have to. So, but
we don't necessarily have to. It's kind of just a thing that's like the internet kind of set that standard, but like we don't have to.
I feel I have to.
Okay.
Because I really like this film.
Right.
You just kind of said everything I wanted to say about it. But I will say this. I'm right there with you when it's a 4 out of 5 stars. We got to do a little digital high five, Dom.
Yes. Because I gave it 4.5. So
that's what I said. Yeah. 4.5.
I thought you said 4.
No, 4.5.
But maybe you cut out there. I don't know. We're both exhausted. Heat exhaustion, people. It's a fun thing. So
4.5 stars, man.
Yeah,
great
it's
film.
a good movie. It's
my number one movie of the year.
It's my favorite movie of the year so far. Exactly. We finally, Invisible Man finally got beat. Only like 5 months later, but it finally got beat. So 2020 people. That again, like amount of movies coming out get cut in half. So we'll take it as we get it, and maybe next month we'll be back at the theaters actually watching Tenet. So we might get a new movie sooner rather than later. But so. That's it, people. This is the Talkin' TV podcast. I'm Dom. That's Chris. I'm the movie nerd. He's the TV nerd. We're on YouTube. If you get a chance, give us a like, give us a comment, give us a subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on the King of Staten Island. Be sure to follow us on our socials, both for this podcast and our personals. It's Talkin' TV on Facebook and Instagram. Talkin' TV podcast. We also have an audio-only version of this on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes. If you could go over and listen to us there, it would also be greatly appreciated. And also be sure to follow all of our personals. I am Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. And Chris is
Christian Evanko. My first and last name. Do not wear it out.
Exactly. And
I
the
love
only
a
thing that
corny
I'll
dad.
say is before we head out of here is I can't wait to see Pete Davidson in Suicide Squad. That's all I got to say
That's his
there.
thing?
That's a thing. I knew it was going to
wow,
shock you because
okay.
I knew you didn't know that.
I did
So
not know
I
that.
just had to shock you
Now
there.
that's going to be the test. He's starting to turn me on his side. We'll
Yep.
see
So
if
now,
he
like I
can,
said,
keep me
now
there.
we will determine whether he continues to play parts like this and get stuck in that rut that every comedy star does get stuck in inevitably, or if he'll actually be able to turn it around and show that he's got a little bit of range. So
Yeah,
only
so
time will
Dom,
tell, people.
before we get out of here, why don't you sort of tell people what they can expect if this is their first time hitting our channel here on YouTube or on Anchor, you know?
Well, also, we've got a bunch of stuff on our YouTube channel. We've got a bunch of different podcast episodes talking about all different variety of topics. But just on our YouTube channel alone, we've got a couple of reviews up. I'm personally doing a Marvel ranking series where I'm ranking the MCU movies at some very interesting hot takes there. If you've got your own designated thought, who am I kidding? You're a person that grew up, that was born between 1980 and now. You've seen every movie in the MCU. So, what's it called? So compare your MCU rankings to mine. They're on this channel. Just last week, we talked about I Know This Much Is True, which is the HBO miniseries that was shot here in our hometown of Poughkeepsie, Wappingers, and LaGrange, New York. We're finally on the map, people. And we are. Well, we kind of already were when A Quiet Place came out, but yeah.
But now we're like, this is our actual stomping ground.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, we've got a lot of cool stuff further on down the pipeline. We've got a few watch-alongs under our belt. We got 2 Star Wars movies. We got a Jurassic World. We got a Toy Story 3. But stay tuned for some more interesting stuff. And again, if you want to find out what we're doing, follow us on our socials. That's where you get the information that you need. And Chris, can I say my line?
Yeah, or subscribe on YouTube. We have a lot of content coming your way. Bunch of watch-alongs slated for July and August. It's going to be a lot of fun. And if you guys are new to the show, well, you're in for a treat because there is one and only one way that we love to end this thing here on Talkin TV, and it is by me handing it over yet again to none other than Dom Rizzi, aka the Movie Nerd. Dom, do you have a message for the people here today?
Only the same one that I have every time. People watch more fucking movies. And now, because we're in Corona, you have no excuse to not do otherwise because there's nothing else to do. Peace out.